She was a mail-order bride who arrived on a Wednesday and was left on the platform before the hour was out. The coach from the railhead came in at 2:30. She was the last one off. Single bag, a dress that had been pressed before the journey and had not survived it. Her hands loose at her sides and her chin level in the way of a woman who has decided in advance not to fall apart. Albert Pugh was waiting at the far end of the platform, with a folded paper, and the look of a man who had been rehearsing bad news, long enough that the rehearsing had made it worse. He had filed the contract 8 months prior with the agency. He had spent the time since changing his mind and had written no letter because a letter would have required courage he did not have before. Witnesses were present. She had spent 3 years at the orphanage where she had grown up and stayed on, taking in, mending, saving what she could, waiting. When the solicitation came, she read it twice, signed her name, and spent the last coin she had on the ticket. Albert said he couldn't go through with it, loud enough to carry, which was the whole of the cruelty, because the platform was not empty. And by supper, half the town would know, and by morning the rest would. She stood and let him finish, hands at her sides, her face doing what she needed it to do. He waved the agency papers once, not a deed. Everyone on that platform knew a woman was not land and could not be claimed as such, but he held them like a man who wanted the weight of paper behind him. And then he put them back in his coat and walked away without looking back. The platform cleared around her. She remained bag at her feet. The town spread out in front of her, and no clear answer to what came next. Across the street, a man came out of the hardware with a paper bag of fittings and stopped on the boardwalk step. 32 years old, broad in the shoulder, a carpenter's hands, sawdust on his sleeve from the morning. He looked like a man who had carried too much for too long, long enough that he had stopped noticing the weight. He stood on the step and read the platform, the bag, the straight back, the empty space where a man had just been, and then he crossed the street. He stopped at the bottom of the platform steps and looked up at her. "Seth Callen," he said, "I've got 2 children and a house that needs keeping. I do carpentry work 3 days a week, so mornings you'd have the place to yourself." He held her gaze. "It's temporary. Room and board until you've sorted what's next." She looked at him for a moment, taking the measure of him. "Can you cook?" he said. She met his eyes. "I can, and I'm not afraid of hard work." She picked up her bag. "Then let's go," she said. They walked off the platform together, and behind them the town watched and stored it up for later. The cabin sat at the edge of town, with a horse in the side pen and a porch step that had been meaning to be attended to. She noted it without comment. Inside, the front room was clean in the way of a house managed by a man alone, functional, orderly, with nothing soft in it. A workbench along the far wall, a stove doing its steady work. On the shelf above the kitchen window sat a small sewing basket with a wooden lid. It had the look of something no one had touched in a long time, something everyone in the house had quietly agreed to leave alone. Seth told her the room off the kitchen was hers, her own door, her own space. Children ate at 6 o'clock. He ate when he was back. Jack came from the rear of the house with the timing of a boy who had been listening from somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. 10 years old, his father's build already in the shoulders, a face that kept its own counsel. He looked at Willa, the way a person looks at something they have seen a version of before and are not ready to feel differently about. He looked at his father. Then he turned and went back the way he came, without a word, which said plenty. Mary did not make an entrance so much as she materialized. 6 years old. One ribbon tied properly, and one simply hanging, standing near the bedroom doorway with the full and unguarded attention of a child who has not yet learned to want things quietly. She looked at Willa with her whole face. Willa looked back, steady and even, nothing performed. "Are you hungry?" Willa said. Mary considered this seriously. "A little bit. come help me find what's in the larder." Mary came without hesitation. Supper that first night was beans and cornbread and a broth that had no business smelling the way it did given what the larder held. The smell reached the front room before anyone sat down. Seth came in from the yard and stopped just inside the door, and something moved across his face that he set aside. Jack ate quietly. Mary ate with her eyes moving between her bowl and Willa in steady rotation. Partway through the meal, Mary set her spoon down and said that the last woman who kept house for them had burned everything she touched. Seth said her name. Mary looked at Willa instead. "She did, though. Burnt beans are a serious matter," Willa said, eyes on her plate. "I don't take them lightly." Jack looked up. The corner of his mouth moved once and returned to where it had been. He said nothing more, but when supper was finished, he stayed at the table a little longer than he needed to before going to bed. And Seth noted that, without comment. The following morning, Seth came off the porch and the loose step held solid under his boot. He stopped, pressed it again, stood there a moment. He went inside and poured 2 cups of coffee and left one on the counter near where Willa was working. Nothing said about the step. She said nothing about it either. They drank their coffee in the early quiet, and the cold morning settled in around the house. Jack tested her on the 5th day. He simply did not do the thing she had asked and settled in to wait. Willa appeared in the doorway of the back room. "Jack, the wood." He looked up. "I was getting to it." "I know. Get to it now, please." He looked at her, held her gaze, found what he was looking for, then got up and brought the wood in without argument. She thanked him plainly and went back to the kitchen. Seth had heard it from his workbench. He set his plane down and stood in the quiet for a while before picking it back up. The days found their shape after that. Jack began staying at the table after meals, whittling or reading, present in a way he had not been. Mary followed Willa from room to room, with the devotion of a small shadow, helping where she could reach and watching carefully where she couldn't. Seth started coming home from his carpentry work at the same hour every evening. One evening, Willa read to Mary from the book of stories on the shelf, doing the voices without embarrassment. Mary pressed against her side, with the complete trust of a child who has made a decision and sees no reason to revisit it. Jack sat at the far end of the room, with something in his hands. He did not look up. He did not leave. By the time the frost had settled into the mornings for good, Mary had stopped trailing Willa like a guest and started trailing her like a child at home. It was a gray, unremarkable morning when it happened. Mary was moving through the kitchen in her socks, still warm from sleep, absorbed in some private business, when she caught her foot on the threshold between the kitchen and the hall, and went down hard on both palms. The sound she made was the startled kind, the kind that comes before a child has decided whether this warrants tears. She decided it did. Willa came down to the floor with her before the crying had fully started, took both small hands in hers and looked at the palms and held them warm and steady, not making a fuss, not going anywhere. And Mary, without meaning to say anything at all, said the word that was simply true. "Mama." It went into the cabin and did not leave. Willa's hands stayed where they were. One breath, no more. And then she gathered the girl in and held her until the crying ran itself out, calm and certain and giving no outward sign of what the word had done to the room. Seth was in the bedroom doorway. He had heard it. He stood with one hand on the frame and looked at the hallway floor without moving. Something was happening in him, and he kept his eyes away from it. Some things change the moment you look at them straight. At the table, Jack had gone still. 10 years old. He knew exactly what he had heard, and exactly what it meant. And something in his face that had been shut a long time was working slowly toward open. Seth went back into his room and sat on the edge of the bed, with his hand flat on his knee. and stayed there while the morning moved quietly around the house. Abigail Cutler came to stand beside Willa at the general store counter on a Friday afternoon with the warm and practiced manner of a woman delivering concern she had prepared at home. She spoke about appearances, about what people were saying, about the natural shape a situation found when it was left alone, and the confusion that came from children being given the wrong idea about what an arrangement was. She chose her words the way you choose tools for what they would do. She left without buying anything. Willa set her coins on the counter one at a time and walked home. 25 years old, and she had been assessed by women with prepared voices in enough rooms that she had built a durable patience for it. The patience of a woman who knew that another person's measure of her was not the truth. She stood at the kitchen window with her hands on the sill and looked at the yard and the line of pines beyond it and the cold, flat sky longer than she needed to. Then she started supper. That evening, Seth was at the stove and she was finishing the dishes, and without looking up from the fire, he said, "You all right?" She kept her hands in the basin, thought about it honestly. "I am," she said. He nodded once at the fire. She went back to the dishes, and the room held its quiet around them both. Nearly a month later, Dale Marsh had no intention of causing trouble. He was at the saloon on a Tuesday evening, talking the way men talk at the end of a long day. Easy, unhurried. He said the Callen place looked different lately. Smoke at the right hours. The children seemed steadier. That woman from the platform, the one Albert had left standing there in front of half the town. Something about her, Dale said. The kids had taken to her like he hadn't seen before. Older one coming around. Younger one had started to call her Mama. He reached for his glass. Albert had gone still at the end of the bar. Dale kept talking, not noticing, said it was good to see that house with some life in it again. Albert looked at the row of bottles across from him. He had the agency papers in his coat. He had a pride that had sat wrong since the platform. And now there was a picture forming in his head. Warm light in the windows. Children settled. Smoke at the right hours. A woman the children had already begun to call Mama. He set coins on the bar and stood up. "Where does Callen live?" he said. It was a Thursday morning, cold and clear, and Seth and Willa were coming out of the post office together. He had gone to collect a timber notice. She had walked with him because the children were at school, and the morning ran that way. When Albert stepped into the middle of the street, with the agency papers in his hand and his voice pitched to Carrie. The fare was paid, he said. The contract signed. An obligation didn't dissolve, because a woman had found somewhere more comfortable to be. He held the papers up like a deed, though everyone on that street knew what they actually were. Then, he used the word his, and the street heard it land. Everything slowed. A woman near the dry goods stopped walking. Two men outside the feed store turned. The cold air held everything in place. Willa stood beside Seth. She did not step back. She did not look at Albert. She held herself the way she had held herself on the platform, still straight, not finished, except that this time there was someone standing next to her, and the whole street could see that he had not moved. Seth looked at the papers. He looked at Albert. Then he turned to Willa, his voice low and even. "Stay here." Not a command. The way you speak to someone you are coming back to. He walked to the bank. 4 minutes inside, he came back with money he had kept under the floorboards for 2 years. Everything set aside toward buying back into a proper ranch. The slow and patient work of a man, rebuilding from the ground up. He crossed the street and pressed it into Albert's hand and held it there until Albert's fingers closed around it. "That settles the fare, the fee, and every excuse you rode in with." His voice was flat and final. "It does not buy her. It frees her from you. Now go." Albert looked at the money. He looked at the street, looking at him. He looked once at Willa. and whatever he found in her face was not what he had ridden into town for. And then he walked to his horse and rode out, and the cold morning closed behind him. The street held its breath. Seth turned, not to the crowd, to her. She was already looking at him, hands at her sides. The exhaustion she had carried since the platform was gone from her eyes, and something steadier had taken its place. The look of a woman standing on ground that holds. He stood in front of her. The wind came off the hills between them, clean and cold. He had crossed a street before he had decided to. He had left coffee on a counter and made nothing of it. He had just handed 2 years of savings to another man without pause, because standing by while she was taken was not something he was able to be. He was not a man who dressed things up finer than they were, and he was not going to start now. "I'd like you to stay," he said, "as my wife, if that's what you want." She looked at this man, and she took the space that choosing for herself required, and nobody hurried her, and the cold street waited. "Yes," she said quietly and completely with nothing held back. "That's what I want." He let out a long, slow breath, and his hand found hers and closed around it. Around them the town came back to itself. Boots on the boardwalk, a door somewhere opening and falling shut, the wind off the hills steady and clean, and the pale winter sky going on above it all. The ranch would have to wait. For the first time in years, waiting did not feel like losing. Jack was at the table with a short length of wood and his father's smallest plane, working the edge down by feel, the tip of his tongue between his teeth. Mary was on the floor with her rag doll, deep in some matter of considerable importance that did not require adult involvement. From the stove came the smell of something with molasses, a new thing Willa was working out, adjusting as she went, the kind of smell that gets into the walls of a kitchen and stays there for years. The door opened, cold air, and then Seth's boots on the step. The sound of a man who knows his coming home is expected and has stopped taking that for granted. Mary raised the rag doll briefly in his direction by way of greeting, and returned to her business. Jack looked up at his father in the doorway. Then he looked back down at the plane and kept working. The looking had carried something in it that had not been there at the start of things. Seth hung his coat, crossed to the stove, and stood beside Willa, and looked at what was on it. She moved the spoon toward him without a word. He tasted it, and considered it quietly and without rushing. Then he looked at her. She took the spoon back. "I know," she said. "More molasses." The corner of his mouth moved. He went to hang his coat properly and left her to it. On the shelf above the window, the sewing basket sat where it had always sat. The late light came through the glass and found the wooden lid and rested there warm and still. Outside wind moved through the pines at the edge of the property. The horse shifted in the pen. From somewhere past the tree line, a bird called once, long and unhurried. The cabin held its warmth, not waiting for anyone, not anymore. And that was the story of Willa, a woman who arrived with nothing but a bag and a spine and left with everything that actually matters.